Kathleen, if you and your roundtable participants could come up. A lot of people have been asking about what we can do about some of the issues that we presented today. Well, first of all, we've created a LinkedIn group. You can find that on bit.ly/FOW forum. And we'll flash that up on the screen at the end of the sessions today so that you can continue the conversation there. But we've put together this particular roundtable with as many of the internal stakeholders at MIT as possible to bring them together and talk about their angle on this issue and this opportunity of creating shared prosperity and taking advantage of artificial intelligence and the future of work. Kathleen Kennedy has kindly offered to try to corral this a wily and crazy group of participants. She's very intrepid in that regard. She's done so previously in a number of different very large projects at MIT, from Solve to Hub Week to the newest activity at MIT, our tough tech venture capital fund called The Engine. So Kathleen's the perfect person to bring this group together and have a useful conversation about our call to action. Kathleen.
Thank you, Dave, and thanks for that fantastic introduction. And really, thank you and all the organizers for these 2 days. They've been incredibly inspiring. And this panel, as Dave said, is really about what can MIT do? And as Randy Davis said on the last panel, we've been here before. And that made me reflect on a statement that I heard, and I think it was Martha Edison that said in a meeting years ago, that one of MIT's best inventions was itself. And that made me then think about when MIT was founded, we were in a bad spot in the US. And MIT helped to transform the US economy. And it feels like, we just heard from Jeffrey Sachs and everyone over the last 2 days, that we're sort of in one of those spots again. And so our charge here is, what can MIT do? What can we do to really move things forward and to transform the US economy and really the world to get us through these issues around the future of work? So we have pulled together a lot of the key people from across campus to help us start to think about that. So I'm going to have Tom kick us off and to help to give us a bit of a framework, because really what we want to do is go from talk, which we've done a lot of, and I think it was fantastic to hear all of the things that we've talked about, to go to action. So Tom, if you want to give us a framework to help the rest of the panel as we talk about this for the next hour, what should we do?
Good. Well, thank you, Kathleen, and thank you, everyone, for sticking with us this afternoon. I want to particularly welcome our provost, Marty Schmidt, and our vice president of research, Maria Zuber, who will help us to think about the future. This has been a fantastic 2 days, but it'll only be a historic 2 days if it's a start of something. We've had good discussions now, as Kathleen said. What are we going to do about this? I think there are 3 points that came through in the discussion that give us a beginning roadmap for where to move forward. First, I believe we have reframed the debate about technology and the future of work away from efforts to try to define or predict how many jobs are going to go, how many jobs are going to be created, to what can we do to make sure that we shape technology and the future of work to create a more shared prosperity, as Jeff Sachs and just about every speaker has emphasized. The action orientation of MIT is poised and ready to do this, I believe, and I think that's our challenge, to move forward, to say we can do some things, and we have to figure out what those things are. Secondly, I think we got some clues to what some of those things are, not in full form, but at least the broad outlines of a consensus of some steps that need to be taken. And it starts with what so many of us have emphasized, the importance of lifelong learning, and as Raphael Reif said in the beginning, upskilling the workforce on a continuous basis before the crisis occurs. But also the need to better integrate the design and the development of technology with the development and design of work systems. Bring those two together and help listen to the workforce itself in how to shape the future of work in ways to make these technologies pay off most effectively for the firm, for society, and for all the stakeholders involved. The need to make sure that we do compensate fairly those people who will be adversely affected, because there will be significant numbers, and we have to do a better job of that than we have done in the past. And then, as we're going to hear from a variety of people, particularly from Erik, we have a whole array of policies and institutions that need to be changed and need to be addressed in order to complement the technologies and to work with them to make them effective. Those points all came through, and others as well, but they stand out for me as a starting point. And then the third thing is the amount of energy from the people who presented. It's clear that MIT has something to offer and something to contribute to this action plan, and it's our job now to put some meat on those bones and think about how to do this. And I would just offer one historic point. We have been here before. We have done some of these things before and risen to major challenges at MIT when society calls for an action plan, whether it was in World War II, as far back as that goes, or in the 1980s when the Commission on Industrial Productivity came together to think about how to address some of our challenges, or more recently with the production and the innovation economy, and others like that. This perhaps is more profound than certainly the last two examples I offered, but I think that's where we are right now. And if we can put our energies together like only MIT can do, by bringing technologists and experts in learning that we're going to hear from Sanjay, and research that we're going to hear from Liz, that go out and to figure out how to work with our industry partners and to think then about the role of government policy altogether, there's no place like this institute that can do that better. And so that's what you're going to hear from our colleagues here. We're going to hear about educational needs and using our online tools. We're going to hear about work to go out into industry and how we can understand how they are addressing these issues, or maybe how they might address them more effectively. And then we're also going to hear about the power of the technologies themselves and how we can better join work and technology as we move forward. So let me just turn to our colleagues and go from here.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for that framing. I want to take it now to Daniela. And you've obviously been at the center of this for a very long time. And CSAIL is at the heart. So talk to us about action and what you've already been doing and what more you think we can do.
So CSAIL and of course MIT and the work of many of the speakers who have been here provided us with such an interesting blending of perspectives, which is really important as we think about artificial intelligence and people and work. So I would like to observe that I don't believe we can stop technology from advancing and changing the world. But what we can do is we can be leaders, and we can be right there at the forefront of technology, inventing the future and inventing ways of making the world better with the new ideas and the new results. However, it's very important to pause and think about consequences, and that we get to do. So we get to decide how technology is used and what we can do about consequences we observe. Of course, this requires a number of facets. It requires contributions from policy. It requires conversations between technologists and economists and policymakers. So research in this field is extraordinarily powerful, and advancing AI and advancing robotics today is amazing. We can begin to imagine a world where routine tasks will be taken off our plates, where we have intelligent assistants supporting us with what we do. So that's on the technology side. The other thing I would like to observe is that we also have to reconsider how we educate and train our students, both at the university and beyond, both within the field of, in my case, computer science, and beyond. And I would like to observe that up until now, education has been kind of a serial process. So we study and study and study for as long as we want, some people till high school, some people with a bachelor's, some people all the way to PhD, and then we quit studying, and then we go and work and work and work. But as things are changing, this model will not work so well. So we have to start thinking about models of education that include some form of parallelism, where through experiential learning, in other words, through working, we can learn. And as we work, as we develop as part of the workforce, we continue to train and retrain. So I think it's important to consider how do we go from this serial approach to education to the parallel approach to education. And most importantly, technology will not have direct consequences without the support of policymakers who will ensure that the technology gets used and how the technology gets used. So including policy in our discussions and in our development of technology is very important.
Daniela, thank you. And you opened the door to where I want to go next with Erik and talking about policy.
Sure. Well, I think we have to realize that technology has always been destroying jobs. It's always been creating jobs. It transforms many more. And one of the things we can do as policymakers is not try to hang on and preserve the old jobs, but rather embrace what Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. And how can we create a policy going forward that makes the new jobs better and more fulfilling than the old ones and more plentiful and give people work they can do. And I think, so I wrote a lullaby that I think mothers and fathers could sing to their kids to help remember what the policy should be. I don't know how good it is, but it kind of goes like this. There was a neural net, saw a cat, E-I-E-I-O. Catchy, no? So, well, I use that to remind myself what the policy implications could be, and I hope you all sing it to your children. So E stands for education, and Daniela, and we've talked about that a lot today, it should be at the top of the list. And it's not just investing more in education, it's reinventing education along the lines we talked about to embrace the kinds of things that machines don't do well in creativity, interpersonal connections, teamwork. We don't do that well in education. In fact, in many ways, it seems like education is almost designed in the 20th century to stamp out education, get people to sit in rows of desks and stop being creative, just listen. And that's, of course, exactly what we don't need in the second machine age going forward. The second letter, I, is for immigration. And I think that one of the big mistakes we're making in our society today is not embracing all the smart people from around the world that want to come here, that we educate, and then we force them to go back. I think whenever someone gets a degree from MIT or any school, that should be stamped with a green card to say, please stay here. And that would be a policy that would, I think, be very helpful to the dynamism of the country. The next E, EIE, is for entrepreneurship. And as I suggested, we shouldn't be trying to protect the past from the future, freeze in the old jobs. And in Boston, there's a policy to take money from Lyft and Uber and the new ride-sharing services and give it to the taxi companies and try to get them to hang on a little bit longer. Some cities just ban these new services altogether. And over, entrepreneurs who have new ideas face barriers from the entrenched incumbents. But the job creators, the people who invent new goods and new services, they're entrepreneurs, and we should make it easier for them to invent new things for people to do, new ways of combining technology and capital and labor to create value that take advantage of these new systems and allow us to do things that we couldn't have done before. EIEI. The next I is for incomes, and we need to do a better job of supporting incomes. And so the earned income tax credit is my own personal favorite. This is a way of subsidizing and supporting wages. It's like, in a way, a little bit like the minimum wage, but the difference is the minimum wage is paid entirely by the employer, in a way is a tax on people who come up with new jobs and say, you guys, great job coming up with these new jobs for people, but we want a special tax for you to help pay them more. And I think it's a responsibility from everybody in society to help lift those up. And the Earned Income Tax Credit actually encourages businesses to come up with new jobs, and entrepreneurs to come up with new jobs, and then the people who are engaged in the workforce, they get more income, and I think they don't just get income. I've learned from my sociologist friends like Bob Putnam, they get a meaning and a way of contributing to life. And that's very important to them, to all of us. And last but not least is O for original research. And for that, I want to stress the importance of understanding this better. I'm at MIT, so maybe I'm a little bit biased. I'm a researcher, but I think that there's a lot of evidence in economics that this is what drives economic growth, drives higher living standards, is coming up with original research, not just the applied work that the companies and the entrepreneurs are doing, but the more fundamental research on the technologies. But I think especially we have a bottleneck now in understanding how the economics and political and social systems need to also be reinvented. So if we do those 5 things, I think, and those are all roles for government, we could go a long way to making this transition much better and have these technologies be what they were meant to be, some of the best things that ever happened to humanity.
All right, so that's the policy foundation. Thank you, Erik, very much, and I will now always remember that lullaby. Love it.
Please sing it to your children, your nieces, your grandchildren. I think it's going to catch on. It's going to be big.
So I want to take it now to Liz, and I think you opened the door there with talking about one thing MIT is also very good at is doing research with industry. And really, when we're talking about work, that's talking about companies. So how do we help companies think about how they need to reinvent work?
Well, I don't have a lullaby to sing, but I'll start with some thoughts. I just want to reflect a little bit on takeaways I had from the extraordinary 2 days here, and particularly from the social science perspective. That there were, I'd say, 3 things that I took away that I think inform our direction at MIT going forward. The first was uncertainty. I think there was actually a fair amount of humility about knowing what the future holds. We don't know what that path is. And there's no one, we're not looking to a crystal ball to try and predict, and I appreciated that. The second piece was for all the boundless opportunity, people talked about limitations. They talked about limitations in the technology, and they talked about the friction of adoption. And we can define friction in a lot of ways, but friction for firms and industries, for particular regions even, in adopting new technologies. And I think we need to acknowledge that. And the third one that I was really excited about and I felt was embodied MIT and the larger community here was the principles that need to be reflected in the use of this technology. Fairness in the way we collect the data, the way it's used, fairness and access. And on all those dimensions, I think MIT can be a leader. And so first and foremost, in terms of the uncertainty, I feel like we need more knowledge about what's happening in firms, in industries, and on the ground. And we have an enormous, obviously, long history at MIT of working with firms about that. But we know that no adoption of technology is frictionless, right? We know it differs between the size of industries, large firms, small and medium-sized firms. Our PI work showed the challenge for SMEs in terms of adopting new technologies and how challenging that can be. We know that technological feasibility is not the only dimension for how firms are adopting new technologies. When we talk to firms today, particularly large firms, they're looking at the cost of deployment. They're looking at existing facilities and what the cost of this deployment of new robotics might be, whether in customization we really do we have robotics that really can be as flexible as we need to be and really replace humans. And so there's a whole host of things that we don't yet fully, I think, have a handle on. And I want us to see basically more work, more evidence that I think is going to help us stop jumping from these two, utopian, dystopian pictures and get into the reality and the evidence. And I think that the regional ecosystems also, and we've heard about that today in many different ways, but they're responding differently. Institutions are responding differently. We're going to learn a lot over the next 5 years. And that's the time frame I feel like I'd like us to be really focusing on.
We'll come back to the 5 years.
Can I add something
to
what Liz said? So it's very interesting to think about the new principles that need to be embraced, like you said, Liz, fairness, privacy, and to really consider that we could have extraordinarily creative and novel new solutions that in some sense blend the perspective from the different sides, from economics, and from technology. So by understanding that these are economical issues, we can invent new algorithms that are by construction fair. They are that will provably protect your privacy. So it's really interesting to think about the role of technology and the role of policy in solving some of these problems. It's not either or. I think that the solutions would necessarily have to blend the two perspectives and come together. So there is a lot of opportunity for original new work.
That's why you're sitting next to each other. But I think, actually, so I want to come back to that point, but first I want to come to Sanjay, and I want to go, can we go a little more tactical? And let's really start talking about what can we do? And you've been charged with how do we reinvent education?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting question. You know, we have an education system that's only about 200 years old, and it was born in the throes of the Industrial Revolution. And really, we took away sort of the apprenticeship system and replaced it with a system that creates automatons. And now we're concerned that they'll be replaced by automatons. So we need to fundamentally rethink our education system. That's sort of point number one.
Yeah.
I had the good fortune of taking over a project that was created initially by our then provost, Rafael Reif, and Anant Agarwal, which is the concept of massive open online courses and online education. I'm the vice president for open learning. edX was spun out of MIT with an investment from MIT and Harvard. edX has itself reached, with completely online courses, about 11 million people worldwide in 195 countries. And MIT courses, which are branded MITx, on edX have reached about nearly 3 million people unique. So, you know, it's a big impact. But the interesting thing is that and by the way, I should say that Tom and Daniela are two of our stars in these online courses, and we hope to get the rest of our colleagues involved as well. But the interesting thing is, we thought the median age of these students would be like, 18 or 19 or 15 trying to get into college. It is 27. And what that means is that the hunger is amongst working professionals. So that's point number one, and we're in early days. We have some challenges, which I'll talk about in a minute. Point number two is, our one-and-done model of education is sort of awkward and artificial. You study for 2 years or 4 years, finish your high school, you get your degree, and you're ready for the rest of your life. Surely that cannot be the future. A future in which jobs have life expectancies which are shorter and shorter, Truck driver, that's a job that's going to vanish pretty much. And so we have to really elevate ourselves and teach meta skills and teach students to learn new skills, adapt, and so on, which comes back to my automaton sort of comment. And maybe someday in the future, every employee at every company is going to spend 2 hours, perhaps on a Friday morning, simply upgrading their skills. Because let's face it, we're on a treadmill that's going backwards slowly. And if we don't keep jogging, we're going to fall off the treadmill. And the third point I want to make, and we're sort of in the early stages of this, is I think that the separation of work and learning is artificial. And imagine, in a couple of years, an engineer goes to maintain a Lufthansa aircraft that's landed at Logan, and as she walks up to the engine, her, HoloLens glasses give her details on how to fix, the latest on this engine. It was last maintained in Singapore, another 10,000 miles before the blades get refurbished. Oh, by the way, did you know that next year we're going to go to a new Inconel alloy? And, blink your eyes if you want a podcast on your way home, right? So this business of learning just in time as you work, I think, will become a new reality. The fact of the matter is, we have to learn all the time, and we're very excited at the Office of Digital Learning to take all this forward.
Excellent. Okay, so before I go to Barbara, which I will in a moment, I also am going to open this up to the audience. We want this to be an interactive discussion, and we want to hear from you on ideas that you have around what MIT can do. But first, I'm actually just very curious, how many here in this audience have taken an MITx course? Excellent. Good. Okay, so I'm ready for your questions in a second, but while you're lining up, Barbara, let's talk about how we can bring at MIT technology experts together and our business experts together and actually start to do some meaningful things. I know you've been already thinking and doing about this.
But I'd also like to comment, particularly on the education front, which absolutely we're at a point where it's already being reinvented because people are accessing means to learn online in a variety of ways, and it's happening in all sorts of places in all sorts of ways. It has to be at least 5 years ago now. I went out to look at some automation of factories in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in that region, and there was a program in place for workers to gain higher level skills in combination with a community college, in work, in place, and on their own time. And there's right in Fall River, there's a community health facility where Bristol Community College and the community health facility have collaborated so that the learning is happening and certification is happening in place. One of the things that I would love to see is for the research, the original research that Erik is talking about, be in part going out and looking at what's going on. Rather than presuming right off the bat that we, the leaders, will come up with the answers, to go out and see where this transition is already occurring. We had this wonderful moment this morning with Rusty Justice, and let's go out to Kentucky and take a look at that. Let's go out to these places and see where this transition is happening. What are the barriers and the opportunities for more entrepreneurial activity in places like this? What are the real barriers? Is it the barrier of imagination? Is it a barrier of finance? What's the ecosystem that needs to be in place? Is it the fact that we need an infrastructure policy that brings broadband there? But we don't really have those answers yet. But we have the capability of looking at this and bringing the perspective from many different starting points across this institute into the country in a way that is a two-way street. So I'd love to see a lot more interactive learning and original research that involves going out and looking at the companies that are making the transition and talking to the workers that are making the transition and looking at these communities that are trying to figure out a version of entrepreneurship that isn't Silicon Valley and isn't Boston, but is something very particular to these communities.
I want to do a speed round real quick, and then we're going to come to the questions. But I think all of you have already been doing that a bit. Erik, I know with your inclusive innovation competition. Daniela, of course, with working directly with Rusty. Just real quick, what are your thoughts on what Barbara just said, and how can we do more?
No, this is absolutely critical. I was just yesterday teaching my PhD class in between some of the sessions here, and we talked about how going and visiting companies is kind of like a secret weapon that you kind of learn what's really happening before you go and do the econometrics. And for me, the Inclusive Innovation Challenge has been a great resource to hear from hundreds of companies doing just amazing things to use technology to create shared prosperity, inclusive, not just central. And let me just give you a couple really quick examples. I mean, we heard yesterday, or I think it was today, about how machines can diagnose radiological images better as well as humans. But if a human and a machine work together, they can do better than either of them can do independently. Or there's a chatbot that Sebastian Thrun helped develop, and he uses it to help people choose online courses. But the interesting thing is that they found that just having the chat by itself didn't really work very well. Instead, they have it work with the humans who also are in the chat rooms, and the chatbot kind of gives suggestions about, you might consider this course or this price point or even this phrasing of a response. And he had about a 50% improvement in throughput on that. But there are lots and lots of examples of how AI and humans can work together. And I think that's something you don't hear about quite as much in the research as you see when they're actually rolled out in the practical implications. Almost inevitably, you end up having some kind of a hybrid system where people do parts of the job and humans do other parts, and machines do other parts. And the net effect is a better product for the customers, lower costs, and a better work environment for the employees.
The hybrid system, that's interesting. Daniela, real quick.
So, well, I agree with Erik, and I will give you one example. And we are working with physical therapists to bring autonomous wheelchairs in hospitals. And this is an example of how technology plus people could do better, because technology could take the boring part of the job, leaving people with the time to apply expertise. So right now, in hospitals, physical therapists have to travel to the hospital room to pick up the patient, push the patient to the gym. They have their session, and then the physical therapist takes the patient back. So a significant amount of time, of the physical therapist's time, is actually spent doing just pushing the wheelchair. So if you introduce technology, if you introduce autonomous wheelchairs, which are ready to go, we can have them, then we will increase the amount of time the therapist spends with the patient, and that's good for the physical therapist, that's good for the patient. In addition to that, back to your question about working together with industry, I would like to say that CSAIL actually has a program that is centered on industrial connections, and this program has been creating a suite of training courses, online courses. In fact, Lori Glover heads this program, is the director of this program, and we have had tremendous success. We have worked in collaboration with other departments at MIT. Our big data course touched over 10,000 professionals, which is really significant. And so we're really very excited about doing more of this. Through our program, we also find that when we do research with companies, it really helps to have people exchanges. So it really helps to have engineers from companies come to spend some time with the researchers at MIT, because this way we learn from companies what is actually important, what are the assumptions that really matter to them. And they come to us, they retrain, and they get a longer time horizon about what is coming.
Awesome. Liz, quick.
Yeah,
tech
quick.
and machines. I mean, tech and people.
Well, just to say, so a few years ago, as part of this production and innovation economy work, our team was out in the field interviewing small and medium-sized companies about their adoption of technology. And what we found was this real barrier to access. And we'll be going back out and seeing those same firms in 2018, and at the same time working with some of these robotics companies who are trying to penetrate this market, have a lot to offer at a reasonable cost that is really increasing productivity and capabilities, but there's a real barrier for getting into those companies. We have the large companies aren't really focused on the supply chain just yet, and we have to find ways to help those companies.
Tom.
Real quick, we do a lot of work with companies and their workforce, sometimes companies and unions. We've done that over the years, bringing them to campus, doing studies with them, and then working cooperatively to implement these ideas, most recently with Kaiser Permanente on a lot of these work and technology issues. But let me just mention one different kind of study that we have underway right now, and that is to go to the workforce itself. We just completed a national survey of what kind of voice do workers want on these kinds of issues. And we've got 3 of our really crackerjack MBAs out there working with some of the newly emerging worker organizations to find out how they're using technology and social media and other things to try to improve the world of work. So we can bring that perspective into this process as well. There's a lot going on out there, and the workforce is very eager to engage these issues.
All right, and then Sanjay, and then we're going to go to the questions. Sanjay, you've hired Bill Bonvillian to examine what's going on out there. Do you have any initial findings from him?
That's very interesting. I think it's not, first of all, it's a great question, and when the rubber meets the road, all sorts of truths emerge. Our first few courses were very high-tech, so it made a lot of sense. For example, Daniela has been involved in a bunch of these courses on big data, et cetera. But when you get down to things like manufacturing, you really need to understand where people are, what skills they don't have, finding the gaps, and bridging them to a point where our courses are useful to them. So, for example, we did a course with Boeing. Boeing was deeply involved in the needs. We developed the content. It's won several awards. What Bill is doing for us is really mapping out, Bill Bonvillian is mapping out, working with Liz and others, the landscape there of all the activities and all the gaps, so we can try and fill the gaps as opposed to do something that from here, sitting in Boston, seems to make sense.
Fantastic. All right, question here.
Sure, thank you.
Say who you are, and please try to keep your question brief and say who you would like to direct it to.
Absolutely. Well, question is actually directed to everyone. Okay. My name is Laura Taylor Kalle. I'm at the Council on Foreign Relations, and I'm a recovering policymaker and has now moved into research for various reasons. But at the Council, we're also we've launched a task force on the future of the U.S. workforce and really looking at these issues from a global competitiveness standpoint. Two of the main things, I appreciate a lot of the comments you all made. Two of the main issues that we deal with as policymakers are, one, who is the most appropriate actor for a lot of the policy recommendations that you all have suggested, and the other piece of it is, how do you scale? So how do you get the information on what's being done at all these various sort of local levels? And then how do you take the information that you get from them, that particularly you all at MIT get on all these various randomized control trials or various pieces of research, and then use that to scale it in order to actually make policies that you can implement at the federal, state, and local levels. So one of the things I would say I would implore you all to do is to figure out a way of making the research and the data that you do have much more widely available and collaboratively done with the government as well as with industry in order for us to be able to make policies that we can scale and bring forth for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Barbara, you want to start?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess one of the opportunities is that there are a number of what I would call intermediary organizations that have credibility and are convening powers with policymakers. So at the state and local level in particular, there's the National Governors Association, the National Conference of State Legislatures, there's the Conference of Mayors, there are all of these organizations. And the potential for making these ideas and policy recommendations accessible through those organizations, because they're always looking to for good ideas, and particularly good ideas that have grounding in practice that they can recognize and they can see they can do. So that's one thing, one way to move this along. And similarly in business organizations through organizations like the Precision Metal Forming Association, the National Association of Manufacturers and Manufacturing, their healthcare associations and so forth. So it's the potential for spread is greater if the ideas are accessible and if organizations that are credible to those players and where they gather and where they have their conversations, if those ideas are
well, and we've also talked about that those institutions are breaking down, though, and so what is the rise of the new? But Erik, you want to, or Tom, you want to pick up on that?
Well, I think there's a variety of emerging organizations in addition to what Barbara mentioned. Those are viable, but I think what we have to do as a community, as we move forward, we're used to doing our careful research and then publishing it in the Journal of Irrelevant Facts and Statistics that nobody reads. We'll continue to do that because that's very important, and that's not going to go away. But we've got to communicate in new ways. We've got to make sure we get our research out at a much faster pace to the people who can use it in ways using all of the tools of social media and a lot of interaction. And our best impacts have come when we've involved those groups in the research itself, not in doing it, but in helping to think about the problem and helping to disseminate the work. So I think if we build those partnerships and we use the modern tools of communication, we can have a bigger impact with our work as we go forward in the next 5 years than in the past.
That's really interesting. Daniela and then Erik.
So I think we have to create opportunities for people to have sustained, to spend sustained time working together on these issues, and this requires resources, because that's the only way you get people to work together on a problem. It's really the best way to bring people together is to have them solve a problem. So I'll give you an example. At CSAIL we have a center on privacy policy, and so the center has theoretical computer scientists, has systems researchers, AI researchers and researchers in policy and economics. Actually, it's a cross-institute activity. And this is extraordinarily exciting because through the work of this blended perspective, you could really see what technology can do, and then the policymakers can really understand the scope of technology and figure out what needs to be put in place in order to ensure that technology is maximized and used for the greater good.
Erik?
So let me build on it. You asked who is the key actor, and I've had the privilege and the opportunity to talk to a bunch of people at, up to the most senior levels of government, state and local and national. And after talking to them, I've come away quite convinced that the key actor that needs to be influenced is the citizen. It's you guys. Often I talk to these people and they're like, you know what, Erik, I get it. What you said make a lot of sense. I read your book or whatever. But unless the voters are behind me, I can't do this. I can't. People want something else. They think that the problem is with immigrants or with something else. So until we change the conversation, until we get people understanding what are the things that need to be done or that can be done, and that we're not going to be able to change the policymakers. For better or worse, we live in more or less a democracy, and a lot of the other countries are like that too. And those policymakers really do respond directly or indirectly to voters. They care about that. And I'm so glad we're having this conference here because I think we're doing a really important public service is getting all of you engaged, and hopefully you'll get more of your friends and colleagues and fellow citizens and voters engaged, because unless you guys are part of the conversation, I don't think those policymakers are going to listen to Daniela or me or Tom or any of us. They may understand it intellectually, but they are ultimately going to act in their political self-interest.
I would just like to add that it's kind of on us to really explain to the public at large how what we do can make their lives better.
In new ways of communication.
Something we really have to step up.
Right.
Great. Okay, next question.
Sure. My name's Peter Owings. Normally when there's a call to arms, which this is what it sounds like, you need some sort of adversary to really raise the level of urgency and define, that in 5 years we have to get to this point for this to really be successful. So who would you consider your adversary? Would you say it's Silicon Valley? Is it China? Is it the government?
No, I don't think it's a person. I don't think it's an organization. I think it's the state of the world we find today that was emphasized for 2 days about wages and economic conditions being stagnant and the anger and the divisions that has caused in our society. That's what we're fighting against. And if we fight against those conditions, then I think we will galvanize our energies in the right way. But I don't see an enemy out there. I mean, we could conjure one up, but I think it's the situation that we're in, and if that continues to get worse, then we are, as a society, in a very, very deep crisis.
I'm just going to say that I think populism is a very dangerous outcome of what's going on today in this country and abroad, particularly we see in Europe. And so, we may not want to point our finger at that, but that is the dark side of all of what Tom has just said, and it is really important for us to challenge it and try and do something about it.
All right, next question.
Hi, my name's Alan Davidson. I'm a fellow at New America in Washington, D.C., and also a fellow at IDE, and a fallen engineer from MIT. And most recently, a refugee from the Obama administration. I left government in January. I've been at the Department of Commerce. And my question is really about how do we build more capacity, particularly in this technology, policy, business conversation, and that you've touched on. Because there is, I will say from the front lines, that there is a desperate need for more leadership in this space and more people coming into this field who have the ability to understand this very complex system that we as a society need to manage. And I will say that in government, I benefited a huge amount from talking to some of you, and we benefited as an administration, but it's small pockets, and it's somehow still a little bit few and far between. I mean, MIT does not have a law school, it does not have a public policy school. There aren't a lot of places that offer even the leadership that MIT does. How do we get more, and how do we train and inspire more young people, and how do we get more research in this space? What can we as a community do to get more of this?
I think Daniela and Sanjay really want to jump in on this. How do we train more people better?
So I am so excited about the idea that in the 21st century, we should have digital literacy. Everyone should know how to use computers and solve problems with computers. And so we should start from kindergarten. And if we start from kindergarten, by the time you get to graduate high school, you will have the skills required to enter the IT economy. And so this actually requires serious rethinking of our schooling system, of what we teach in schools, what we teach as part of the undergraduate education and as part of the professional education, and also what we teach online.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better, I think. And by the way, I also think that if you look at because we do a lot of work in K-12, if you look at citizens under the age of 15, kids, actually change is already happening. In some ways, I think we are the problem. A lot of them are the YouTube generation. They learn on Khan Academy. And in fact, I think that tsunami is going to hit universities, and they're going to ask us what the hell we're doing here. You know, when a kid has grown up, you know, as a maker, is asked to sit in a classroom and listen to the professor talk, right? I think to Daniela's point, digital literacy, meta skills, cognitive skills, creativity, these are things, this is a revolution we have to create now so that our graduates are more elastic.
Quick comment, Tom?
Real quick. We have some experience in doing this, and Barbara and I have talked about bringing young researchers, other PhD students, young faculty members from around the country to engage with us and to support them to get on with doing the kind of research and the kind of translation that policymakers need. We did this a number of years ago when the Sloan Foundation funded a whole bunch of industry studies, and we built a network of those young researchers. There are now the leaders, because that's 10 and 15 years ago, and they're now the leaders in our academic fields. They've built a whole association called Industry Studies Association to do that. We can be a hub for engaging others, and if we use the reframing of the debates that we're talking about here today, we will get lots of young people to be inspired to do the kind of research and translate it then for policymakers.
Can I just add something? I was so excited to hear from BitSource this morning, to hear Rusty. Anybody can learn to code. So coal miners can learn to code, you can learn to code, anybody can learn to code. And in fact, the idea of taking some of the undergraduate curriculum and pushing it down to schools is totally doable. In fact, MIT is already doing that through a course organized by Lincoln Labs called the Beaverworks Summer Institute, where kids get to build the same robots and write the same kind of programs that our entry undergraduate courses in robotics accomplish. So I like to tell young people that if they know how to make stuff and they know how to program it, then they have superpowers, because they can imagine anything, they can make it, and then they can breathe life into it through programming.
People and machines, superpowers. And in fact, we heard yesterday about Tom Malone's new book coming out called Superminds, The Power of People and Machines. And so I think we've got a really exciting opportunity in front of us, and MIT is poised to lead. And I see that we've got Marty Schmidt sitting in the front row. If you'd be open to commenting on the action that we've talked about here, and what you think about what we should do and what we're doing, and if you want to add anything about people and machines and how we engage better and communicate in new ways and reinvent education.
Thanks, Liz, or Kathleen. I didn't know you were going to call me.
Oh, I thought you did. I thought you were making notes for us.
Well, I took notes, but no, I think this has been a great discussion and obviously a great 2 days. And I think my takeaway is we've got a lot of great ideas, and the question is, how do we synthesize those into actions? And particularly, I think, understanding, there was a comment made that I think is really spot on, which is, how does this scale? How do we get to a scale where we really have impact at the level we need to? And so I think that's to me, the most important question that's in front of us is, which of these ideas can we really bring to scale and have impact?
That's a good challenge, I think, for all of us to take away. Thank you, Marty, and I'm sorry that I took you by surprise there. But you thought on your feet like a good MIT provost. Thank you. Barbara.
Kathleen, the challenge, I think, particularly after these 2 days, is not which of the ideas, but how do all of these ideas come together, and what's the vision that's going to drive us? I mean, from what I've heard in the last couple of days, and the way I see it is, if we're looking some number of years out, we'll have among individuals this sense of confidence that they can navigate in this environment, and that AI is actually an assist to them in moving through a life that is continuous learning and continuous churning, in a sense. But there'll be this level of confidence and a sense of stability, and that somehow we have to figure out how to get there. And at a community level, all of this is an assist to address some of the really challenging issues that are facing communities around transportation, around community health, around education as well, and somehow, and building ecosystems for economic activity. When we look at places like Kentucky, it's not a function of let's just move away from here, but this is where we want to stay, and we can make this. So at a community level, we figured out as a society how to make this all work, and at the national level, that it helps us to get back to the notion of making good policy choices that are informed by good information, and that we have real-time, much better information. I mean, a lot of the information that we rely on in policy, should we choose to use information, is old. So how do we bring all of this together, and what is MIT's special contribution to that future? And I think there's an enormous contribution that MIT can make.
And I think we're going to continue this conversation. So Barbara, thank you for those last words, and I look forward to that conversation, as I'm sure all of you do. And thank you so much for all of your contributions today.
Thanks, everybody. We're moving